Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon to what is our final Adam Smith Week event. I've been thrilled at the amount of turnout all week long, and I appreciate everybody taking the time and effort to attend these events. Hopefully you've found them worthwhile. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Professor Peter Calcano. I am a professor of economics here at the College of Charleston and the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process. You'll see on the tables in front of you little tents with QR codes. So if you are so inclined, please scan those with your phone. It will take you to a survey to provide us some feedback about the events, as well as record your attendance here if that is important for you. The mission of the Center for the Public Choice and Market Process is to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society, and we do this through a variety of programming. We have a semester-long book colloquium every semester. Students get to read and eat pizza and discuss books, right? Come for the pizza, stay for the ideas, right? That's the thought. We do our free market speaker series, right? We do a regional reading group, which is the colloquium sort of on steroids for a weekend, but we partner with other universities around the region. And of course, we have Adam Smith Week. And again, I hope that you've been attending and were able to attend some of the other really incredible events. They have been recorded. So if there is an event you missed, we'll be posting them on our website later. If you would like to learn more about the center, right, check out our banners. All of our socials and webpage information is there so that you can continue to learn about the center and the events that we do. One of the things that I am extremely excited about that's going on right now is the application process for our market process scholars and public choice associates. So that deadline is March 24th. This is our mentoring program. Students that are in this program get to participate in all the center events, and we do a variety of activities, research and workshop that go beyond the public events. And so if, again, you've been interested in what the center's been doing, then I would encourage you to check out our webpage and learn more about those programs. At this point in time, actually, I want to bring up one of our public choice associates, Christian Wright, to introduce our panel of speakers this afternoon.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Christian Wright. I'm a part of the Center of Public Choice and Market Process. I just quickly want to advertise a new minor that will be coming out in August of next year. It is the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics PPE minor. So if you have an interest in economics, political science, or philosophy, and you don't plan on majoring in any of those three, this is a perfect minor for you. It gives you a groundwork in sort of what our college is built upon, and that is a great liberal arts education. Even if you are planning to go into finance, the corporate world, whatever, having the communication skills and the background in political science and philosophy and econ is essential in a diverse workforce. So if any of this is interesting, please email Dr. Maldonado, and I will also put this flyer back there for you to check on your way out. But moving into our amazing panel on economic freedom and women tonight, allow me to introduce Dr. Ann Bradley. She is the George and Sally Meyer Fellow for Economic Education and Vice President of Academic Affairs at the Fund for American Studies. She's also a professor of economics at the Institute for World Politics, and she got her PhD in economics at George Mason University. And her general research interests now are in political economy of terrorism, in the post 9/11 political economy regarding Al-Qaeda. Next on our panel is Rosie Fike. She's an instructor of economics at Texas Christian University. She got her PhD at Florida State University, and her dissertation was on the impact of economic freedom on the lives of women. And her research interests are in economic development, public choice, and new institutional economies. And lastly tonight, Meg Tuszynski. She's research assistant professor of economics at the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University. She's the assistant director of Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom at SMU, and she got her MA and PhD at George Mason University, and her interests are in Austrian economics, public choice, and political economy. So please allow me to welcome our three panelists to the College of Charleston.
All right, how do I get my slides up here?
Escape click and it should be there.
Escape. Is there a... Oh, here we go. Here's this thing. Do I use a Mac? So I'm not used to this. Okay, let's see.
Go down to
Go down to the bottom. There is mine. Awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for the introduction. I want to thank Pete Calcano and the Center for Public Choice and Market Process here at the College of Charleston for inviting me out to speak this evening. I am thrilled to be discussing the program that we've been conducting at the Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom for the past couple of years on economic freedom and gender disparity. But before I discuss that specific project, I want to give just a brief overview of what economic freedom is and how we think about economic freedom. So in short, economic freedom is the freedom to make your own choices, sort of free of restrictions, as long as you don't trample upon the equal rights of others. An easy way to think about it is the sort of textbook definition of a free market economy. That's economic freedom. And for years and years and years, economists have thought economic freedom is really important for promoting all of these other beneficial outcomes. Milton Friedman, way back in the 1960s, had a book, Capitalism and Freedom, where he said economic freedom is a crucial component in getting economic growth and all of these other normatively good things. But until the 1990s, economists didn't really have a single metric for measuring economic freedom. And so Bob Lawson, who's currently the executive director of my institute, Jim Gordney, who was Rosie Fike's dissertation advisor, Milton Friedman, a number of other economists got together and came up with this economic freedom index that rates and ranks countries in terms of how economically free they are. And this index has been updated annually since the 1990s. We now have data on 165 countries, data going back to 1970, yearly data since 2000. It's a really, really amazing resource. And so there are 45 indicators that we grab from places like the World Bank and the IMF and divide those 45 indicators into these 5 key areas. So a country is more economically free when the size of government is relatively smaller. People have more runway to make their own economic choices. When the legal system is strong enough to protect property rights. When a country has sound money, sort of low and stable rates of inflation or levels of inflation. Freedom to trade internationally, pretty timely and self-explanatory. And regulation. When regulation is more reasonable, then economic freedom is greater. And so we plug all of this into the way that we measure economic freedom. If you're interested in knowing how we do that, freetheworld.com, beautiful URL, will tell you where your most interested country ranks and how we go about calculating this index. But after we plug all of this in, these are our top 5 countries. Hong Kong, big caveat, we are just looking at economic freedoms. We're not looking at personal or political freedoms. There are other indices that do that. But Hong Kong is our long-running, usually the top of the economic freedom index. Singapore, Switzerland, New Zealand, and the United States. So passes the sniff test. Those are reasonable countries that you would think have high levels of economic freedom. And then the bottom 5, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Sudan, Syria, and Algeria. Should note that there are a couple of countries in gray here that we either don't have data or we don't trust the data that we can get. And so countries like North Korea and Cuba, we do not rank because we just don't have good enough data to be able to rank them, but we're pretty confident they'd be very close to the bottom if we were able to do that. So what we're here today talking about is economic freedom in women. And what Rosie, who's going to be up in a few minutes, did in 2016 and then incorporated in the 2017 index was really amazing. She looked at this index of economic freedom and said, wait a second, something is a little bit off here. There are many, many countries where the real lived economic freedom experience of women is different than that of men. If you live in Jordan or Syria or Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, you're not experiencing the same economic freedom if you are a woman as you are if you're a man and can't work outside the home without a husband's permission, or travel outside the country in the same way that a man can. And so she introduced a tweak to the index that accounted for the differential sort of treatment of men and women in these different countries. And so you don't have to read the little tiny print, please don't, it's really tiny on the screen. But I wanted to put this up here because there are 17 different questions in this. She found a source called the Women, Business, and the Law Index. It's produced by the World Bank. And 17 questions in that index help measure how women and men experience different sort of lived experiences of economic freedom. And she divided these questions into 4 different categories. So freedom of movement. Can a woman, measures things like, can a woman travel outside the country or outside her home in the same way that a man can? That's not true in many countries, women and men can't travel in the same way. Freedom to work. So can a woman get a job in the same way as a man? Or can she choose her own sort of vocation? Can she work in an industrial job or in a dangerous job in the same way that a man can? Again, not true across many countries. Do men and women experience the same sorts of property rights protections? In many countries, men and women don't have equal ownership to a movable property. In many countries, daughters cannot inherit assets in the same way that sons can. And so those are real limitations, real curtailments on economic freedom for women in those countries. And then the last category here in this gender disparity index that Rosie created is legal status. Can a woman be the legal head of a household? Can she sign a contract in the same way a man can, or start a business in the same way a man can? Again, in many countries, the answers to those questions is no. And so Rosie updated the index, our index, to account for these real differences in economic freedom experienced by men and women across countries. And so there are about 70 countries, I think actually 69 countries, where there's no formal legal disparity between men and women. On the books. So United States, most Western European countries, about 70 countries around the world, at least on paper, men and women are legally equal. Now there are other, maybe informal barriers to full economic participation, but we'll set those to the side. Legally on the books, about 70 countries, men and women are formally equal. This list of countries are some of the sort of most unequal countries. If you look at the bottom, they get more and more unequal in terms of their treatment of men and women as you go down the index here. So some of the worst are Sudan, Yemen, Niger, Iran. These countries, women are really disadvantaged economically as compared to men. This one is what I really want to get at before describing the project that we did through the Bridwell Institute. So I told you how we measure economic freedom in that very first slide. These are the countries that fall in the economic freedom rankings once you incorporate that differential treatment of men and women. As I mentioned, there are only 165 countries that were able to actually rank in the index. So like Jordan falling 22 points in the rankings, that's a significant decline. Even some countries that we think of as being, pretty good economically, big trading partners for us, like South Korea and China and Japan and UAE, fall in the rankings once you incorporate that differential treatment of men and women. So there is all of this research, decades of research. Again, the first version of the Economic Freedom of the World Index was published in '96. So we now have decades of research finding that economic freedom is associated with just a broad variety of really good outcomes. Countries that have higher levels of economic freedom tend to see higher levels of economic growth, lower rates of unemployment, cleaner environments, more tolerance. I've got Jeremy Jackson here somewhere. Happiness, Inequality is lower in countries that are more economically free. Like, pick your favorite indicator. There is probably a study showing that economic freedom helps you get there. But what we did in our project at the Bridwell Institute is say, those studies just look at the impact, most of those studies just look at the impact of economic freedom for the average person in a population. On average, economic freedom is associated with economic growth in more economically free countries. And so what we asked is, are there some subgroups of the population who maybe don't share equally in those benefits of economic freedom? And the easiest bite at that apple was looking at men and women. How do women fare compared to men in more economically free areas? So Rosie asked, and she really kicked off this whole conversation on economic freedom in women by asking how our measurement of economic freedom changes once we incorporate that differential impact of treatment of men and women across countries. We asked a slightly different question. We asked our authors in our project here to explore how economic freedom impacts a variety of different women's outcomes. And so we commissioned 15 papers. We had nearly 40 proposals, people who wanted to write papers for us, just exploring a broad variety of different ways in which economic freedom might be important to women's lives. And this is an ongoing project. All three of us are actually involved in another round of these papers at a different university right now that's exploring a whole new set of questions. So that's pretty cool that the snowball is still rolling. So I've just got the Economic Freedom of the World Index up here, the map up here, because I'm going to give a couple of, I don't have a ton of time, but I want to give a couple highlights of what some of the papers in our project found. So Rosie and Ann were both involved in the project and wrote really amazing papers, but I'm not going to discuss theirs because I think they will, and I don't want to steal any of their thunder. But Claudia Williamson Kramer at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga had a really, really cool paper where she said that countries that are more capitalist, countries that are more economically free, tend also to promote and protect women's legal rights better than countries that are less economically free. They impose like fewer restrictions on women's economic activity. That's really, really cool, a really cool outcome. We had a number of papers that looked at entrepreneurship, female entrepreneurship relative to male entrepreneurship. And so one of our authors found that when there are big jumps in economic freedom in a country, over the short term, like 5-ish years, it doesn't really matter. Men and women benefit equally from improvements in economic freedom. Still an awesome outcome. But over the 10-plus year period, women actually benefit more than men do. They're able to open more, especially opportunity-based entrepreneurial ventures than men are when there are these big improvements in economic freedom. We had a couple of papers that looked at economic freedom and female education. So when there are countries with big improvements in economic freedom, they tend to see improved female literacy rates. Improved primary school enrollment was that one. Another paper looked at when the gender disparities between men and women start to close. We see improved female literacy rates and a variety of other improved female learning outcomes. And this is a huge deal. In many of those countries that I mentioned where there are these gender disparities, females don't enjoy the same educational experience as men do. Just a couple of other papers, and then I'll wrap up and turn it over to Rosie, because she has just a very cool set of things to talk about here. But we had a couple of papers on economic freedom and fertility. So Gary Becker, Nobel Prize-winning economist, said that it's found that when countries grow richer, people tend to have fewer children, but invest more in the children that they do have. So Carrie Lawson, one of our authors, found that economic freedom is a big channel for this occurring. When countries become economically free, women have more economic opportunities, and so they have fewer children so that they can take advantage of those economic opportunities and help their children take advantage of those opportunities as well. The last one I want to talk about, because I want to make sure we mention, we don't just measure economic freedom across countries. We rate and rank at my institute, or help update these indices that are published by the Fraser Institute, economic freedom across the states as well. And so one of our sets of authors looked at economic freedom and what's called the fertility gap, which is the difference between how many children a woman says she would like to have and how many she actually ends up having. And I thought this was so cool. In states where economic freedom is greater, women are having closer to the number of children they say they want to have. which is just really, really interesting. I don't know what the mechanism is, but that's a cool, cool finding. So I like to say that with economic freedom, you get more bang for your buck than you do with something like gender quotas or gender mandates or paid, maternity leave or something like that. Like, there are other ways that we can help women. But as I showed earlier, with economic freedom, we have decades of research showing that there are all of these amazing benefits that come from economic freedom. And now with this project and our continuing projects, we found that economic freedom sort of helps promote women's opportunities, maybe in some cases better than things like quotas and mandates. And so if you want to help promote women's opportunities, maybe pushing for policies that increase economic freedom is a good way to go. And I'll turn it over to Rosie.
Thank you guys so much for having me today to talk about my research on economic freedom and women's well-being. And I appreciate Meg for setting things up quite nicely, because I don't have to talk about as much of the background information as I normally do. But I want to start with this quote, because yes, we like economic freedom because it does bring us lots of nice things, but being free is a good thing in and of itself. So this is one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite economists, Jim Buchanan. Woman wants freedom to become the woman she wants to become. So when I think about economic freedom, to me, it is about having permission to take control of your life, right? The permission to decide who you want to interact with, what occupation you want to pursue, who you want to engage in trades with, the ability to say no if you don't want to pursue a particular path. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be successful, but you have permission to try, and you have the ability to learn from your mistakes and your failures. So through this ability to be free, we can discover better who we want to be and the kind of life that is meaningful for us. And that's not going to look the same for all of us. So when I first started doing this research, it was a lot inspired by conversations with my friends. I've always considered myself a feminist, but a lot of economists don't like that word. And I'm an economist, so I love markets, and a lot of my feminist friends don't. They're very skeptical of capitalism. And so I was really fighting in my head about, if I really care about women and their well-being, is there a way to accomplish, the outcomes that I want without sacrificing markets? And so that kind of kicked off this whole research agenda. And so theoretically, there's many reasons why I think economic freedom should benefit women. So Montesquieu, in his work, Spirit of the Laws, proposed what we call the du commerce thesis, and this quote, "Commerce is a cure for the most destructive of prejudices, for it is almost a general rule that wherever we find agreeable manners, there commerce flourishes." So it's this idea that to be successful in the market, you have to demonstrate certain types of behavior, right? If you want to be a successful businessman, you have to be honest, right? You can't cultivate a reputation for being a liar. You need to be on time. So things like prudence and honesty and other virtues that we find to be important become more prevalent in societies that are more market-oriented. So prejudice type of views, discriminatory behavior, we would expect, if the du commerce thesis is correct, that we would expect there to be less discriminatory behavior in countries that are more economically free. Gary Becker's work on discrimination really talked about how market competition acts as it imposes a penalty on people who are acting on their discriminatory preferences. So the way this works, so say we live in a sexist society where people have a preference for hiring male employees. That means they are going to be, if we have a male and a female with similar skills, the employer is going to prefer to hire the male. What that means is you're going to be able to hire women at a cheaper cost. And so an entrepreneur who wants to maximize their profits is going to look for ways to cut costs. Hiring a woman who is just as talented allows me to offer my products at a lower price and outcompete my competition. And if my competitors don't follow suit, they will be left behind. So through that market competition process, maybe it doesn't change somebody's mind or their opinion, but they have to at least act as if they are not discriminating against women. So they might still have those preferences, but they have to hire the woman in order to stay competitive. Lastly, in the spirit of Adam Smith Week, one of the big reasons I think economic freedom is going to benefit women, not just women, economic freedom is good for women, but economic freedom for women is good for everybody, because it expands the scope of the market. In these countries that have very severe restrictions on women's economic rights, you're shackling 50% of your economy, right? How could you win a race with your ankles shackled together? You're not going to win the race. You're not going to live up to your potential. So when we have laws in place that tell 50% of the population that they are not able to fully participate in the economy, we are excluding their talent, their ideas, and those things can benefit all of us. So economic freedom is not just good for women, but women's economic freedom is good for everybody. So Meg showed some of the data in my recent unreleased yet report, the Women in Progress report that I published through the Fraser Institute. The new edition should be out in a couple of weeks. So this data here shows how gender disparity has changed over time. And so the line graph, the good news, if we track women's economic rights over time, gender disparity has narrowed, right? So our higher scores on the gender disparity index actually mean less gender disparity, very intuitive that way. But these higher scores, as we go from 1970 to 2022, restrictions on women's economic rights have been relaxed in lots of countries over the world. Between 2020 and 2022, we have a whole list of countries that have relaxed at least a handful of restrictions on women's rights. And it is countries that do appear in the set of countries that have the most severe restrictions. So Bahrain was on the list that Meg showed as being one of the worst performers, but they have even made some improvements towards relaxing restrictions on women's ability to participate in the economy. Some bad news, we had a couple of countries that introduced more restrictions in the past couple of years, and Saudi Arabia really breaks my heart because Saudi Arabia was dead last for the first several years that I was doing this index, and between 2018 and 2020, they got rid of so many restrictions on women's rights. They got rid of the law that said women have to legally obey their husband. And then they put some of those things back in 2021 and 2022. So now women got to have 2 years without legally having to obey their husbands. Now they have to obey their husbands again, which is a pretty big if your husband doesn't want you to work and you have to legally obey your husband's say, that's not real economic freedom. There's a lot of difference between gender restrictions across regions. So what these graphs show are, I break it apart by global regions. So we have the Middle East, North Africa countries, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, high-income OECD, Europe and Central Asia, and East Asia and the Pacific. And so the Middle East and North African countries as a region tend to trail behind the rest of the world, but even in that region, we see significant improvements in economic rights for women over time. So that is the good news. They're still kind of lagging behind the rest of the world. The high-income OECD countries are at the top of the pack in terms of granting women equal rights, but it doesn't mean that they have no restrictions on women's economic rights, even in those regions. The laws that restrict women's ability to choose the occupation that they want are really pervasive. So there's about 105 countries in the world that have at least one law on the books that say women can't do a particular job. So in Belarus, women, for example, cannot work with pesticides. You cannot work any job where there's pesticides involved. Now, do I think working a pest control business is my best opportunity? No, that doesn't sound great to me, but I guarantee there's at least some women out there where working in pest control may be the best opportunity they have to earn more income and provide for their families. And a law in place saying, no, you cannot do that, cuts them off of that opportunity. I'll just point to the work of John Stuart Mill, where he said, if somebody's really not going to succeed in a particular market, you do not need a law in place preventing them from entering in that market. Just let me compete and fail. If I'm really not good at it, you don't need a law preventing me from doing this. So let me show you some of the outcomes that we care about. So this slide shows a set of different labor market outcomes for both women and men, so that we can kind of compare the differences. So we were looking at labor force participation rates, the labor force percentage with advanced education, the unemployment rates, and the percentage of the population that has an account at a financial institution. And I think about that as being a measure of financial independence. So as you see, if we go from the least free to the most free, in every single one of these labor market indicators, women's labor market performance improves as we go from least free to most free. And if we look at the gap between men and women, it closes as we go from least free to most free. So these gender gaps start to narrow as we have more economic freedom. I love this account ownership at a financial institution. I always think about economic freedom as being, it's really a human rights issue. If you are a woman and you are in a difficult situation, right, maybe an abusive marriage, how do you get out of that situation without economic freedom? Right? If you can't get a job and you can't open a bank account and you can't move freely out of your house, how do you escape a situation? So economic freedom provides financial independence to populations that could be vulnerable without access to those economic rights. There's a variety of health outcomes that improve as we go from least economically free to most economically free societies. I focused here mostly on childbirth outcomes and human trafficking. So your lifetime risk of maternal death declines significantly as we go from least free to most free. And part of that is your access to skilled healthcare professionals during birth increases a lot as we have more economic freedom. Your child is less likely to die in the most free countries. And you are much less likely to be human trafficked in the most free countries. In terms of educational outcomes, at every single level of education, primary, secondary, and post-secondary, the educational attainment of women increases as we move from least to most economically free. The gaps narrow, again, between men and women. And the number of people who are not pursuing any kind of human capital training declines as we go to more economic freedom. Again, the opportunity cost of not pursuing, not building your human capital is a lot higher when you are living in a society that has an open market where there are many more job opportunities. It doesn't make sense to go to college and pay all that money and work as hard as you're working if you can't put that degree to work and earn some money off of that later in your life. So the incentive to be acquiring higher levels of education is much greater when you have economic freedom. I want to talk a little bit about gender norms as well, because one of the things that economists argue that is a driving force behind things like the gender wage gap are our social norms about what is the appropriate role of men and women. And so I looked at how economic freedom relates to a measure of gender norms. So I look at data on do we think jobs are more important for women than men? Do we think that men make better political leaders than women? Or do we think university is more important for boys than it is for girls? So if we say, yes, jobs are more important for men, men are better political leaders, and university is more important for boys, then that society is kind of exhibiting a preference for men over women in these areas. And so we can kind of take it as somewhat of a proxy for gender norms. And so what I find, if I look at these pieces of data separately, or if I aggregate them into a norms index, more economic freedom is associated with gender norms that are more tolerant of women taking on these roles. There's more people disagree with the statement that these things are more important for men than for women. Lastly, to point to the paper that I wrote with my co-author Abby Hall as part of Meg's commissioned papers, we looked at the role that economic freedom plays in improving women's labor market outcomes and compared that with gender mandates. Right? Gender mandates are really, really pervasive. There's 134 countries in our sample that have a law in place that says you can't fire a pregnant worker. There's 86 countries that have equal pay mandates. So these gendered mandates are one way that we could get at improving outcomes for women. We can accomplish feminist goals through these top-down mandates, or we can maybe see if economic freedom can work through the bottom up. Gender mandates, if we have more gender mandates, we are restricting economic freedom, so they are somewhat at odds with each other. And so we do kind of an empirical horse race between these two metrics and see which one performs better on a variety of labor market outcomes. So we look at 6 different labor market outcomes: labor force participation, unemployment rate for all women, unemployment rate for highly educated women, the percentage of women in vulnerable employment, a measure of human capital, which is both education and health, and the percentage of females that are employers, so the percentage of female workers that have employees. And we control for economic freedom, the level of income, political rights, civil liberties, and a list of gender mandates. And what we find, we run 76 regressions in this process. Economic freedom does much better than gender mandates. In 40 out of the 76 regressions, economic freedom is significant and improves the outcome that we're looking at, and it only made things worse in 3 of the 76 cases. But when we look at how gender mandates perform, it was only significant with the correct sign in 19 out of 76 regressions. Really, the only one that seemed to matter is giving men parental leave. If you give fathers access to leave after the births, more mothers will join the labor force, which makes sense. But it was significant and made things worse in 13 cases. But more often than not, the gender mandates did not exert any significant impact on the outcomes once we control for economic freedom. That's what's doing the work. It's not the top-down approach. So, in conclusion, I view economic freedom as a necessary condition for women to flourish. It may not be a sufficient condition, but it is a necessary ingredient for women to be able to flourish. Women seem to live healthier, more successful labor market lives with higher education if they're in free societies, and gender norms are more tolerant of women entering less traditional roles. So with that, I will turn it over to Anne.
Well, thank you, Pete, for organizing this week. It's been such a pleasure, and I know we want to leave time as well for some questions today. So I'm going to talk a little bit. Again, I was part of this group that was asked to kind of think about research related to economic freedom in women. And so I had kind of a different approach, and it was based on an experience I had about 3 years ago. Meg knew I was going to tell, and Rose knew I was going to tell a story, but I was at a very small colloquium, and we were debating actually trade policy based on some readings we had to do. But we went way off trade policy, and we had a conversation, and there were kind of people on what we might call the new right. This is an element, a group of people that are kind of in the conservative circles. And they made the claim that life was better in the 50s and 60s and 70s than it is today, especially for men. And that one way to rectify this problem was to pay women to stay at home. So there were like 12 people here in this thing, right? And there were three of us were women. And of the 3 women, I think 2 of us were married, and the 2 that were married had kids. And I kind of raised my hand and I said, I don't understand. We're here on a weekend, away from our kids, away from our husbands, and that's okay. But we think that other women shouldn't be allowed to do that. And the solution to that is that we want to use government money to pay them to stay home. And so I was like rage driving home. My husband was like, you're in a bad mood. And I said, I don't understand this thinking, and I think it's just principally wrong. So I submitted to Meg and said, I want to write a paper on whether there is such a thing as too much economic freedom. Is it bad for women and families? Are we too rich? Do we have too much stuff? So the full title of my paper was Rich in Things, Poor in Spirit, right? So do we need to return to the 1950s? Let's talk about it. So I like to think about technology and the particular role that technology has had on household production functions. In the 1950s, these are ads from 1950s magazine, like Life magazine, okay? So the first one over here is a Christmas idea. Give her a Hoover and you give her the best. A little holly leaf, okay? So the idea is that the wife in 1950, her job is to keep a clean home, to manage the laundry, the cooking, the cleaning, gardening, anything like that, raising the children, and to have a suitable home. And part of that meant when the man comes home at night, it's clean. And I don't know anybody that doesn't like a clean home, right? But this was primarily the woman's domestic job. Okay, so the idea was you give your wife a Hoover, and you make her better at her job, and she doesn't really have any alternatives to that job, right? And so the women in this room that are going to college, right, this is not what you anticipate for your most favorite Christmas gift, I'm assuming, right? Because a lot has changed. Here's another similar ad, and I think this ad gets to the mythology. So I say a lot of economics, and why I enjoy economics is about myth busting. Because there's a lot of kind of ideas held out and kind of in the public, and one of them, as I said, came up in this colloquium, that there's just too much economic freedom, we're too rich, we care about all the stuff, and it's eroding family structures, and it's changing the household in a very negative way. And so the question is that true, right? So I think this picture, though, gets to the mythology, right? The idea that in 1950, look at what the woman is wearing. She's perfectly dressed, she's wearing heels, she's got a pressed apron on, she's happily vacuuming, the dog is running around, I don't want my dog anywhere near me when I'm vacuuming, right? She's actually afraid of the vacuum. All this stuff, right? So it's this idyllic life, and the question is this real? And was it idyllic for both partners, right? And I think we can guess some answers to that question. So one of the things that we study when we look at economic freedom over the decades that we've had this, and you've seen this already, so I won't spend a lot of time here, because I know we want to leave time for Q&A, but it's the outcomes of economic freedom, right? And what are some of those outcomes? We live longer lives. We live happier lives. Rosie already mentioned this. We get to make more of our own choices. We get income mobility, we get literacy, we get educational outcomes, or educational attainment goes up. But including, we get increased employment opportunities for women, which is good as a matter of fact, because to Rosie's point, it means that the labor market is not held back based on gender, right? So it means everybody can kind of, as Deirdre McCloskey would say, give it a go. Give it a shot. Figure out what you think you want to do, what is your comparative advantage, and be able to do that. But it does mean that we're going to have changing habits, traditions, and division of labor within the home. So again, I've been here since Tuesday, and my husband is home with the kids and the dog, right? So I'm not making a lot of decisions. I don't know what they're doing right now. I'm like, feed them, make sure they go to bed, you're good to go. But a lot of these traditions and habits change. We also see, and Rosie already mentioned this, that we get declining birth rates, right? Because people are making different types of choices about when to have children and how many children to have. They're also making very different qualitative investments in each child. right? So 150 years ago, you're having a lot more children per woman, not necessarily out of just pure desire, but it's because you have a very high mortality rate. So even in colonial America, if you wanted a legacy name, if you wanted a son named John, and you had 3 boys, you might name all 3 of them John because the mortality rate of your children was so high. We don't do that anymore, right? So household production and childbirth has changed. So there's a lot of other factors that have changed, especially in the post-World War II era. We're seeing people delay marriage, and that's going to reduce your fertility because the older you are, your fertility starts to decline. So there's a lot of things that are going on here, but I want to spend a little bit of time today talking about technology, because I think one of the things that liberates men and women, but in particular women, is access to machines in the home that replace what we used to do. So I was telling these ladies earlier, I used to teach at Grove City College, which is 5 hours away from my house, so I would drive, I would teach 1 block class, I would stay in the alumni house, and I would go home. And I came home one weekend, and there was a buzzing noise in the condo, and I said to my husband, "What is that?" And he said, "I bought us a Roomba." Notice he said, "I bought us a Roomba." And he was using the Roomba, he was, and it was like, we have a dog, we have kids, I don't want to vacuum. So I can literally outsource all vacuuming now, because a stick vacuum, I have to hold it, I'm involved, right? But a Roomba, I just push a button. A dishwasher, I push a button. So these are washing machines, refrigerators, and vacuum cleaners. And this is over about a 100-year period. And so what we think about, which is good in markets, which is that as machines replace manual labor, we get more from less. That's true in manufacturing plants. It's true in your home. And it also, in particular, liberates women. So if you want to have that pressed apron and heels and vacuum, I want you to be able to do that, right? So this is about choices. And economic freedom is correlated very strongly and very consistently over the years that we've studied this with higher income, and income gives us choices and changes our opportunity costs. It also changes the household production function. So when I'm hearing from, there's forces on the left and forces on the right that are anti-economic freedom as it pertains to women. So as Rosie mentioned, there's kind of a group of feminist scholars, right, that are kind of like socialism is the way, it's going to create more equality. Those arguments are as old as socialism is, so we understand what those are. And then there's another, a newer set of ideas that are coming out of what, again, I call the new right, which is that, well, capitalism is just too much stuff, and it's destroying. They don't like that it's destroyed the old way of doing things in the home, the 1970s way. And there is an argument, right? If my husband was never home, and I was never home, we're outsourcing everything, why have children in the first place, right? So there are some things that really are important that happen between parents and children in the home, but allowing families the ability through growing income to be able to figure out what they want to outsource is the key, right? To allowing people to give it a go and have the best life possible. So what I'm worried about is what I'm calling in this paper familial protectionism, right? So we want to use, there's all sorts of arguments, there's nothing new about them, frankly, that invites the state into the home. Again, in this colloquium, they wanted to give women cash to stay at home, because the idea was if you have more cash, you're not going to work. And actually, in the limited studies that we've seen where we give cash stipends to women, you know what they do? They work more, because they use the money to pay for daycare. So it's like the opposite effect, right? If you give people cash, they're going to make their own decisions about how they want to use that cash, which is actually why economists are generally in favor of cash versus something else, right? So I think the biggest problem here, too, I'm skipping around a lot, but I want to make sure there's time for questions, is that occupational licensing in the United States is a particular barrier to women, and especially women that are at the bottom of the income distribution, who I think those policies are oriented towards and who we should care about. So if you live in Manhattan in a penthouse, you can have 5 nannies, you can overcome all of this stuff. You can work, you can reduce your work, all these types of things. But if you're thinking about opening a business on your own, and I want you to think about daycare, because that's what I'm going to talk about for just the last few minutes that I have. A lot of working class women, when they have a child, they now have a new dilemma. And their new dilemma is, I want to work because I need to. I also want to spend time with my child, but when I'm working, I might need daycare, and I might not be able to afford it. So what do you think these women do? They start daycares in their home. There's an increasing number of occupational licensing that is making it impossible and erecting barriers for women to do this. And so this is kind of state-based, just general occupational licensing. And what you're seeing here is the darker purple. This means that more than 70% of kind of female-dominated occupations require some form of license. The biggest one on the list is daycare provider. We are increasingly requiring women to have a college degree to run a daycare in their home. We're not even talking about kindergarten. We're talking about you're not even 5. And I have 2 children, so I can tell you what they're doing below 5. You're trying to get them to sit on the circle, use their nice words, and don't eat crayons. That's what you're doing. You don't need a college degree for this. I live in Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has the most expensive daycare costs in the whole country, $24,000 a year. Moreover, Washington, D.C. just enacted a law that says if you have more than 10 kids in a daycare in your home, you now have to have a college degree. So the Institute for Justice has taken up the campaign for these women, trying to reduce the barriers. So I think policies that try to protect what once was ignore what people want today, right? And I think they pose fiscal problems because we don't have the cash to run around giving people money to do these types of things. What we can do easily is reduce the burdens of work. That includes kind of daycare regulations, but all sorts of other regulations that we see that particularly burden working class women, like cosmetology. Being a florist. Did you know that if you have a florist, you have to have an increasingly number of hours of training, and I'm not sure even how you make any good case for that, other than special interest rent seeking. So I'm going to stop there, Pete, because I think we want to have time for questions, but I think ultimately what economic freedom is about is changing opportunity costs for women.
If you will, we were talking about norms here, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and establishing norms at the College of Charleston. I want to establish a new norm right now, which is that the Q&A is part of the presentation. And so rather than a mass exodus, right, that I'm going to ask you to stay and listen to what is the most interesting part of the conversation, which is the Q&A, right?
It's only 8 minutes, so.
It's well, I won't say it's the most important part, but it could be the most interesting, right? So let me just say one more thing that I forgot to do at the introduction, which is professionals, amateurs borrow, professionals steal. This was, as Meg said, right, a thing that was done at the Bridwell Institute. I saw it and I said, we're doing it here, right? So I do want to thank these women for being here today, but let's open it up for questions. It's usually our prerogative to give it, to open it up to the market process scholars first if they have a question to start with, and we'll go from there. Lexi?
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Tuszynski. Did you see any trends with states that have recently adopted like very rigid reproductive rights legislation and the fertility gap and like in regards to economic freedom, the index in the United States?
So that's a fantastic question. I should have mentioned that we rely on our state-based data. Most of our data comes from the Census Bureau and other sort of government agencies, and that data is generally released on a 2-year lag. And so our 2024 index, which is the most recent one that came out, reflects 2022 data. And so we just don't have enough time between the changes in that legislation and our current data to be able to study any of those questions. I think those will be really, really interesting questions to study. One thing that I will mention is a number of the states that have passed some of the most restrictive sorts of regulations in that space are also some that are already pretty low on the Economic Freedom Index. And so I think that'll be an interesting question to study, but we're just not there yet. Great question.
Thank you.
Denise?
I have a question for Dr. Bradley. Do you think, because you said more money for more things, but more like social issues, do you think that economic freedom in like developed countries like the United States has made it harder for underdeveloped countries because we like have such overconsumption habits that like put more pressure on their economies, or do you think that's better for their economies?
I mean, I think the interconnectedness of global markets is a positive sum game. And so I think that's the way I'm gonna answer your question, which is that no, it's not. I mean, we were talking about this before, you know, why is the woman in the vacuum cleaning picture ad wearing a dress? Seems ridiculous. And I said, well, think about it. In 1950, you had very few outfits. We didn't have plastics like we do. We don't have spandex and lycra. So, you know, you guys have maybe 3 outfits a day, like your pajamas, your loungewear, your switchwear, this kind of stuff, right? And nobody did before. And so that is a sign of abundance. But abundance is not zero sum if it's done through economic freedom. Now, if you steal, right, if you use plunder to get what you have, then it is zero sum, and it becomes actually negative sum, because then we just worry about protecting what's ours. And so I think the interconnectedness of the global economy is actually what we need to advance economic freedom in the poorest countries, those bottom 5 that you saw, right? What they need is trade, commerce, all the things that go along with that to help them grow their economic freedom, which will increase opportunities for women in those societies. It's a great question.
This might be a very specific question, but this is for the panel itself. Do you feel like there might be a limit, like a cultural limit on the amount of technology that culturally will allow in the home? Because, you know, we hear stories of maybe the rich parents who never see their children because they, you know, pay for the nanny and pay for someone to cook and all these things. Do you think that we have a limit on the cultural aspect of having these technologies in the home, or do you think it might eventually just get to the point where we don't do anything household-wise anymore?
Well, I think that there will be things that continue to get outsourced. And remember, I mean, this is a Smithian point, that it's the outsourcing and unloading what you used to have to do that was very laborious. You know, 200 years ago, I'm churning butter. I'm not sitting here, right? And that's a very time-consuming thing to do. And so to be able to buy it from a store is great. Now, I think there are I have a section in my paper called Can't Buy Me Love. And the idea is that you can't outsource. I can have Alexa, I can actually tell Alexa now, read my kid a bedtime story tonight. But that doesn't replace the bond and the emotion that I have with my child. So I think what matters most, we want to leave to parents and children to be able to do. A machine can't replace that, but a machine can do a lot. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times like 20 years ago, and it's called The Outsourced Parent. And it lists all the things you can have outsourced, including changing diapers, having a night nurse, talking to your kids about the birds and the bees, sending them to college visits. So I would never outsource taking my kids to college visits. That's a great bonding experience that I look forward to having with them. But I think the idea here is that the more we are able to outsource, we can make really good decisions for our children and our spouses.
I just want to build on that for a second. You can pick and choose what to outsource, right?
Yeah,
like
that's
in the 1950s, I would have to make food. I would probably spend less time with my kids because I'm vacuuming, I'm cleaning, and I'm making food. Now I can order DoorDash and play Legos or get yelled at for playing Legos wrong with my kids, right? And so like I can choose things to outsource that actually allow me to spend more quality time with my kids.
Thank you.
I really liked all your panels, and I basically agree with everything you said, but I want to kind of give you a confounding case. The case of Norway, which beats the United States on economic freedom, it beats us on happiness index, and yet they have almost a year of paid leave for either spouse. So what do you think? Would you be in favor of, well, I'll just leave it at that. What do you think explains all that?
There's actually a great book called The Nordic Gender Equality Paradox by, his last name is Sanandaji, he's a Cato scholar. But what he looks at is, these Scandinavian countries, they have all of these gender mandates in place, but if you actually look at the labor market outcomes, like the United States does way better in terms of women's success in the labor market, and we have none of those. You're much more likely to make it to a managerial position as a woman in the United States than you are in any of those countries with those protections. So it's a really big question. These are policies that limit economic freedom, and if you look at the evidence, it's not clear that they're actually achieving the gender equality in the labor market performance. There's still huge gaps in STEM fields there. There's still a lot of women who choose to stay home. So it is unclear that those expensive policies have bought Norway what they tried to buy with them.
We have time for one more question.
There's a lot of hot stuff in the news that looks really bad and sad. For each of you, is there like a real bright spot somewhere in the world that you're just like super stoked to see, and something that everyone should take away to like think that there's a lot of good things?
I think if you look at the data that we showed, like the overall message that I get when I look at the gender disparity data is that things are getting better, right? There's a few examples where more restrictions are being imposed here and there, but the overwhelming message is that women's economic rights are improving year by year. So I think that that's something to be really optimistic about. If we can get reform in places like Saudi Arabia, maybe we want stickier reform that they don't backpedal on, but if we can get Saudi Arabia to relax some restrictions on women's rights, like that gives me hope for a lot of other places too.
Yeah, I want to build on that because the like current news, as you mentioned, is like full of doom and gloom because it's the job to be full of doom and gloom. But if you take a long enough time horizon, like the trends look amazing. You look like the hockey stick of economic growth. If you look at just economic freedom, like it was going up and up and up, and then COVID hit, lost 10 years of economic freedom in 1 year. Very depressing year for us riding the economic freedom index. And then it started going up again. Like that's amazing. So those big restrictions on economic freedom we saw during COVID are being lifted, and we're returning to a good economic freedom trajectory. So again, like take a long enough time horizon, the picture is much rosier.
I agree with both of these statements, and Meg in particular. I mean, if you look at, spend a lot of time on Twitter or watching the news, everything is negative, and it is an amazing time to be alive. We are far better off than we were in the 1970s, and the 1950s, and the 1870s, and on we go. And so, I actually have a child who was diagnosed recently with type 1 diabetes, and I tell my students this story all the time. If he was born 100 years ago, there's no insulin. It doesn't exist. So he has now maximum 1 year lifespan from the diagnosis. And now he's wearing right now 2 devices, one that pumps insulin, one that's a glucose monitor, and he gets a reasonable chance to live as long as everybody else. That's economic freedom. That's why we fight for this. So it's not just about the numbers, it's about how it changes your life and the life of your children and your family, and that's why it matters. And that's the optimism we need to help people understand, right? It's not just about like GDP growth, which 0 people care about, right? Except for us. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's give everybody an opportunity to thank our panelists.